Life often reveals its truths not in dramatic moments but in the quiet spaces when pretenses fall away and the mind finally stops performing. The narrator invites the listener into one of those spaces, where the noise of ambition fades long enough for a different kind of honesty to emerge. He begins with a simple observation. People overwhelm their own lives by caring about too many things, scattering attention like fragile glass across a floor of endless expectations. Most of their suffering does not come from the weight of real problems, but from the emotional exhaustion of investing energy into worries that hold no lasting value. It is a truth many sense but rarely articulate, and he offers it with the unpolished clarity of someone who learned it through missteps rather than mastery. He introduces Charles Bukowski, not as a heroic figure but as a paradox that unsettles traditional definitions of success. Bukowski was crude, troubled, and far from a model of discipline, yet his writing carved a profound space in the hearts of readers. His life did not follow the triumphant arc people admire. Instead, he stumbled through years of rejection before finding a voice that resonated precisely because it refused to hide its flaws. His gravestone, inscribed with a message that almost mocks the idea of perpetual striving, becomes the starting point for the narrator's exploration. Bukowski did not succeed by forcing himself to be extraordinary. He succeeded by accepting that he was ordinary and writing anyway. This defiant embrace of imperfection challenges the listener to question why society worships extraordinary lives while dismissing the beauty in simply being human. As the narrator reflects on this, he examines the cultural machinery that pressures people to be remarkable. He describes a world saturated with curated achievements, where comparison quietly erodes self-worth. People measure themselves against illusions polished for public consumption, believing everyone else is living a grander, more meaningful existence. The narrator exposes this as a collective delusion, one that convinces people that ordinary lives are failures, that normal emotions are flaws, and that happiness must always be earned through exceptional outcomes. In reality, the obsession with being special fragments identity, turning life into a relentless performance rather than an experience to be lived. He shifts into a more intimate rhythm as he recalls his own entanglement with these illusions. When he was younger, he chased recognition, hoping admiration would silence the insecurities he carried. He wanted proof that he mattered, and he believed the world could supply it. But the more he chased validation, the more hollow he felt. Success became an unreachable horizon he pursued with increasing desperation. He speaks about this period with a tone that blends regret and gratitude, the regret of lost years spent chasing an ideal, and the gratitude of eventually recognizing the futility of that pursuit. The narrator then introduces the concept of caring with intention. Humans, he explains, possess limited emotional bandwidth. Every concern, every insecurity, every impulse competes for space in the mind. Without discernment, life becomes a noisy theater with too many actors demanding attention. By choosing what deserves emotional investment, a person reclaims control from chaos. This is not indifference but liberation. It is the refusal to be ruled by every discomfort or desire. The narrator explains that this shift does not make life easier, but it makes it clearer. People grow not by eliminating challenges, but by choosing challenges that align with their values. He weaves this idea into a cinematic reflection on the nature of struggle. Struggles, he says, are not interruptions to life but the threads that hold meaning together. When someone chooses their struggles consciously, pain becomes purposeful rather than overwhelming. When they avoid struggle, they drift into lives shaped by fear rather than value. He describes struggle as a sculptor, carving depth into character through persistence and vulnerability. Without struggle, life loses its emotional texture. The narrator's tone softens as he explains that learning to not care about the trivial is an act of emotional maturity. It allows someone to direct their attention toward relationships that matter, goals that resonate, and truths that reveal who they are beneath layers of expectation. This selectiveness becomes a form of quiet strength, a way of standing firm in a world demanding endless reactions. As this first movement closes, the narrator creates a subtle sense of anticipation. He hints, not with instruction but with emotional gravity, that the path ahead will explore the illusions people cling to, illusions about happiness, self-worth, and the pursuit of positivity. The story settles like a breath drawn slowly, preparing the listener for the deeper unraveling that follows. The narrative resumes with a calm but incisive tone, turning toward the cultural obsession with positivity that has quietly distorted people's understanding of emotional health. The narrator explains that society encourages individuals to pursue happiness with a relentless fervor, promising that with enough effort, the right mindset, the right habits, they will finally feel good. This pressure to maintain positivity becomes a burden, convincing people that negative emotions are signs of failure. The narrator dismantles this myth gently, reminding the listener that humans are not built for constant emotional brightness. The insistence on being happy all the time creates a quiet suffering, one that grows beneath forced smiles and rehearsed optimism. He describes how the expectation to feel good can trap people in what he calls the emotional spiral of self-judgment. When they feel anxious about their anxiety. When they feel sad, they feel ashamed of their sadness. The layering of emotions turns discomfort into torment. This cycle does not arise from the emotions themselves, but from the belief that emotions must always be managed, optimized, corrected. The narrator reveals that the path to emotional peace begins not with resisting negative feelings, but with acknowledging them as natural signals guiding the heart toward understanding. He recalls a time in his own life when he tried to mask his struggles behind a facade of composure. He would tell himself he was fine, that he just needed to push harder, think more positively, distract himself with productivity or entertainment. But the more he ignored his inner turmoil, the more it followed him, tightening beneath every surface-level distraction. Eventually, the weight of denial became heavier than the emotions he tried to avoid. Allowing himself to feel without judgment became the first step toward healing. He shares this memory with vulnerability, not seeking sympathy but offering evidence that emotional honesty is not weakness, it is clarity. The narrative shifts toward the deeper insight that emotional struggle is not an obstacle to growth but an essential part of it. Pain, discomfort, insecurity, these are not signs of emotional failure. They are indicators that something meaningful demands attention. When someone embraces this truth, their relationship with themselves begins to transform. They stop fighting the natural ebb and flow of emotion and start listening to what those emotions are trying to reveal. The narrator explains that much of human suffering comes from values built on shaky foundations. When someone values pleasure above resilience, they crumble at the first sign of difficulty. When they value approval above authenticity, they live in quiet fear of rejection. When they value being right above understanding, they become rigid and defensive. He contrasts these fragile values with healthier ones: growth, integrity, responsibility, curiosity, values that produce challenges but also create long-term fulfillment. He tells the story of a man who built his identity around appearing successful. Every conversation was an opportunity to impress. Every setback threatened his sense of self. Behind the confident exterior was a fragile inner world quietly collapsing under the strain of maintaining an image. The narrator speaks about this man with compassion, illustrating how common it is for people to measure their worth through distorted metrics. These metrics, status, admiration, constant excitement, offer temporary highs but long-term emptiness. Real self-worth, the narrator explains, is rooted in values resilient enough to withstand disappointment. As this movement deepens, he turns toward his own misaligned values from earlier years. He admits that he once measured his worth through attention and external validation, believing admiration would quiet his uneasiness. But attention is fleeting and the chase for it becomes endless. He describes the moment he realized he had built a life around the wrong metrics. It was not a dramatic collapse but a quiet recognition that he felt disconnected from himself. That recognition, he explains, was not defeat, it was the beginning of alignment. The emotional tone settles into a reflective calm as he suggests that the only way to navigate life meaningfully is to stop chasing the illusion of constant happiness and begin choosing the right struggles. Happiness emerges not from avoiding discomfort, but from engaging with what matters. People cannot eliminate suffering, but they can decide which suffering is worth enduring. As the final lines of this part gather into a gentle pull, the narrator hints that the journey ahead will explore responsibility, truth, and the courage required to stop blaming the world for emotional pain. The momentum carries forward quietly, inviting the listener deeper into the evolving emotional landscape. The emotional current shifts into a deeper, slower rhythm as the narrator turns toward one of the most uncomfortable yet liberating truths a person can face: responsibility. Not the shallow kind people associate with blame, but the quiet, internal responsibility that defines how someone interprets and responds to the world. He explains that life will always surprise, disrupt, and overwhelm, yet the meaning people assign to those moments is entirely their own creation. Responsibility is not about fault, it is about agency. It is the recognition that even when events lie outside a person's control, their reaction remains theirs alone. This truth unsettles many because it removes the comfort of excuses, but it also offers a rare kind of empowerment. The narrator reflects on his own past avoidance of responsibility. He recalls times when he blamed circumstances, people, or timing for his unhappiness. Each excuse provided temporary relief but prolonged his stagnation. Blame, he says, is a soft cushion that quietly suffocates growth. He describes sitting in his apartment during a particularly low period, surrounded by unfinished ideas and broken routines. At that time he believed the world was conspiring against him. But beneath the frustration was a deeper fear. If he admitted he was responsible for his choices, then he would also have to admit he had the power to change them. That realization required far more courage than assigning fault elsewhere. He explains that responsibility is the birthplace of freedom. When someone stops waiting for ideal circumstances, they reclaim their ability to move forward. He illustrates this through the story of a friend who lived in a state of perpetual disappointment. The friend carried a belief that life owed him stability, admiration, and success. When he failed to achieve these, he grew resentful, convinced the world was unfair. But his resentment blinded him to the role his own choices played in shaping his life. The narrator describes watching this pattern unfold with a mixture of compassion and sadness, realizing how easy it is for people to trap themselves inside narratives that absolve them of effort but also strip them of possibility. The emotional tone deepens as the narrator draws a distinction between responsibility and control. People often avoid responsibility because they assume it means controlling everything. But control is an illusion. Responsibility is acceptance. Responsibility acknowledges that while life is unpredictable, one's responses shape the emotional aftermath. It is the understanding that a person can choose their attitude even when they cannot choose the event. This internal shift transforms chaos into clarity. He dives into the subtle psychology of responsibility, explaining that many people resist it because it challenges their identity. They prefer stories that protect their ego, stories where external forces dictate their fate. But these stories, while comforting, become prisons. When someone embraces responsibility, they accept the uncomfortable truth that they play an active role in their suffering and their healing. This acceptance is not self-punishment, it is empowerment. It marks the moment they switch from being a passive character in their story to an active author. The narrator describes a moment that altered his understanding of responsibility. He had just faced a painful breakup that he initially blamed entirely on his partner's flaws. But as the emotions settled, he saw the ways he had contributed. His avoidance, his insecurity, his unwillingness to confront his patterns. Recognizing this hurt deeply, yet it also freed him. It gave him insight into who he was and who he needed to become. This emotional honesty became the foundation for healthier future relationships. The narrative flows into the topic of values, building naturally from the theme of responsibility. The narrator explains that values determine the quality of a person's problems. Bad values, such as seeking constant comfort or approval, create problems that drain the spirit. Good values, integrity, courage, curiosity, create problems worth solving. He describes values as emotional compasses. Without intentional values, people drift toward whatever feels easiest in the moment, leading them into patterns of avoidance and resentment. With intentional values, they choose paths that may be challenging but ultimately fulfilling. He emphasizes that responsibility is inseparable from healthy values. People cannot ground themselves in meaningful principles if they refuse to take responsibility for the behaviors that violate those principles. Responsibility demands reflection, humility, and the willingness to confront uncomfortable truths about one's motivations. It also demands patience because growth unfolds slowly, shaped by countless small choices made repeatedly. The emotional tone settles into a contemplative warmth as the narrator explains that embracing responsibility is not a single moment of enlightenment but a lifelong practice. It requires returning again and again to the question, what am I choosing? Through this question, people begin to replace old reactions with intentional responses. They discover that responsibility does not confine them, it liberates them. It gives them the strength to step away from destructive cycles and the courage to build lives shaped by purpose rather than fear. As this movement closes, the narrator subtly suggests that the next emotional turn will explore how values take shape, how they influence identity, and how abandoning harmful values becomes essential for living with clarity. The emotional pull remains steady, guiding the listener smoothly into the next unfolding layer of truth. The narration continues with a calm, introspective cadence as the focus shifts toward the architecture of values and how profoundly they shape the emotional landscape of a person's life. The narrator explains that values act as the silent metrics through which people evaluate themselves. They determine what feels meaningful, what feels threatening, and what feels disappointing. Yet most people never consciously choose their values. They inherit them from family expectations, cultural ideals, fears, or insecurities. These inherited values lodge themselves deep within the psyche, guiding decisions and emotional reactions without ever being examined. He begins by illustrating how misaligned values create internal chaos. Someone who values being liked will sacrifice authenticity to maintain approval. Someone who values being right will reject growth to protect their ego. Someone who values pleasure above all else will avoid challenges that build character. The narrator speaks about these patterns not to criticize but to reveal how quietly they steal emotional freedom. People often wonder why they feel anxious or unfulfilled without realizing that their values are the source of their suffering. He reflects on a period in his life when he valued admiration above integrity. Every interaction became an opportunity to appear impressive. Every mistake became a threat to his self-worth. This constant emotional vigilance drained him, leaving him hollow even when others praised him. He describes how exhausting it was to live through the eyes of others, always performing, always adjusting. The breakthrough came when he realized that admiration is a fragile foundation for self-worth. It requires constant maintenance and collapses at the slightest hint of criticism. Replacing admiration with honesty changed his life, but it required letting go of old identities that had once given him comfort. The narrator dives deeper into the nature of healthy values. Healthy values align with reality. They are grounded in actions rather than outcomes. Curiosity, responsibility, integrity, compassion. These values generate challenges, but they also generate fulfillment. They are difficult to maintain but impossible to regret. He explains that healthy values connect people to meaning because they require engagement with life rather than avoidance. They ask for effort, vulnerability, and courage, which makes the rewards they bring feel earned and authentic. He introduces the idea that values are revealed not through words but through choices. A person can claim to value honesty, yet avoid difficult conversations. They can claim to value health, yet ignore their body's signals. Values become visible in the decisions someone repeats. This realization often forces people to confront contradictions between their ideals and their actions. The narrator emphasizes that this confrontation is uncomfortable but necessary. It marks the moment someone begins living intentionally rather than reactively. The emotional tone deepens as he tells the story of a woman who sought constant validation from romantic partners. She believed love meant being chosen, admired, and needed. But these values made her abandon her boundaries, silence her needs, and tolerate behaviors that eroded her confidence. When she finally examined her values, she realized that she had equated love with approval, not with mutual respect. Changing her values required rebuilding her identity from the ground up. The narrator describes her transformation with gentle admiration, showing how shifting values can heal wounds that once felt permanent. He transitions into the idea that values shape the quality of a person's problems. Someone with shallow values faces endless emotional turbulence, jealousy, insecurity, resentment. Someone with healthy values faces challenges that build strength, difficult conversations, self-improvement, long-term commitment. The narrator explains that life will always contain struggle, but values determine whether that struggle feels worthwhile or draining. Choosing the right values becomes an act of emotional alignment. The narration moves into a softer, more contemplative register as he explains that redefining values requires accepting one's flaws. People often cling to harmful values because those values protect their ego. Abandoning them requires humility, the willingness to admit one has been wrong, misguided, or afraid. This humility does not weaken a person. It strengthens them because it opens space for growth. The narrator describes humility as a quiet strength, one that replaces denial with awareness and resistance with acceptance. As the emotional current settles near the closing of this movement, he suggests that the journey ahead will explore uncertainty, the force that terrifies people yet also opens the door to transformation. The momentum remains fluid and introspective, guiding the listener forward with a sense of deepening clarity and emotional readiness. The emotional tone shifts into something quieter yet sharper as the narrator turns toward the uneasy truth that people cling desperately to certainty, even when that certainty confines them. He explains that the human mind often seeks predictability not out of wisdom but out of fear. The unknown threatens identity, safety, and expectations. When life cannot be predicted, people begin creating illusions of control, plans, assumptions, rigid beliefs, all in an attempt to feel anchored. Yet these illusions act like fragile scaffolding. The moment life deviates, the structure collapses. He describes certainty as a comfort blanket people outgrow but refuse to release. They cling to familiar routines even when those routines stagnate their growth. They stay in relationships that no longer nourish them, simply because the discomfort of staying feels easier than the vulnerability of leaving. They remain in jobs that drain their spirit because the thought of change terrifies them more than dissatisfaction itself. The narrator speaks with calm precision as he reveals that fear of uncertainty often traps people in lives that were never meant for them. He shifts into a more intimate pace, exploring how uncertainty becomes a doorway rather than a threat when approached with humility. Uncertainty forces people to confront the fact that they do not know everything, cannot predict everything, and are not always correct. This awareness is unsettling, but it also opens room for growth. When someone admits they might be wrong, they become receptive to new ideas. They become curious. They become flexible. The narrator explains that this flexibility is a quiet form of wisdom, one that strengthens rather than weakens identity. He recalls a time when he clung to rigid beliefs because they made him feel secure. He believed he understood himself, believed he understood the world, believed he had mapped out the future. Every challenge to these beliefs felt like a personal attack. But once life disrupted his plans, he was forced to question not only his expectations but also the identity he had built around them. This unraveling felt like losing solid ground, yet it ultimately offered him the freedom to rebuild himself not from certainty but from honesty. He learned that certainty gives comfort, but uncertainty gives truth. The narration deepens as he explains that people fear being wrong because they mistake their beliefs for their identity. If a belief is wrong, they assume something is wrong with them. But beliefs, he says, are tools, not definitions. They are meant to evolve. He compares them to lenses that help people interpret the world. When a lens becomes scratched or distorted, clarity requires replacing it, not forcing oneself to see through it. Accepting uncertainty is the act of replacing old lenses with ones that reveal clearer insight. He then explores how uncertainty becomes the birthplace of creativity, connection, and curiosity. People fall in love without guarantees. They take risks without assurances. They create, explore, and reinvent themselves in the absence of certainty. He describes how deeply rewarding experiences often arise from stepping into the unknown, guided not by guarantees but by desire and courage. When someone embraces uncertainty, they allow life to surprise them, to challenge them, to shape them. The narrator illustrates this through a travel memory, walking through a foreign city without a map, relying on instinct and openness rather than rigid plans. The uncertainty felt like a quiet thrill. He found streets he never would have discovered, met strangers who shaped his perspective, and experienced moments that would have been missed if he followed a predetermined route. This memory becomes a metaphor for all of life's unfolding, revealing that unpredictability is not chaos, it is possibility. He explains that when someone clings to certainty, they cling to stagnation. But when they embrace uncertainty, they engage with life rather than fear it. They become willing to make mistakes, willing to learn, willing to be changed by their experiences. This willingness builds resilience, because resilience is not born from control but from adaptation. The emotional tone softens toward the end of this movement as the narrator reveals that uncertainty is the only constant, yet most people treat it as an enemy. When someone accepts uncertainty as a companion rather than a threat, anxiety loosens its grip. They stop demanding that life follow a script and start participating in it fully. The narrator hints that the journey ahead will move deeper into the nature of failure, another experience people misunderstand yet desperately need, setting the emotional stage for the next unfolding truth. The narrator moves into the topic of failure with a tone that blends compassion and precision, as though speaking about something fragile yet essential. He begins by explaining that failure is not the opposite of success but the soil from which success grows. Yet people fear failure with an intensity that distorts their choices. They treat mistakes as verdicts, setbacks as personal flaws, and imperfections as proof that something inside them is broken. This fear prevents them from attempting the very things that could bring meaning into their lives. He describes how people attach their identity to outcomes. When they succeed, they believe they are worthy. When they fail, they believe they are inadequate. This emotional fusion turns every challenge into a test of self-worth, leaving them terrified of risks. The narrator dismantles this illusion, revealing that self-worth is not built through achievements but through the willingness to face difficulty without abandoning oneself. Failure does not diminish identity. Avoidance does. He reflects on his own early years of writing when rejection arrived again and again, cutting into his confidence like small, relentless wounds. Each rejection felt like a confirmation of his deepest insecurities. He questioned his talent, questioned his path, questioned his right to pursue the life he wanted. But over time he realized that failure was simply information. It revealed weaknesses he needed to address, skills he needed to develop, and perspectives he needed to refine. Rejection became a teacher, not an enemy. He learned that success is not built on perfection but on resilience shaped by repeated attempts. The narration deepens as he describes how society romanticizes success while hiding the failures beneath it. People see the polished results, the awards, recognition, or achievements, but rarely witness the long years of effort, doubt, and imperfection that preceded them. This selective visibility creates unrealistic expectations, causing people to believe that struggle is abnormal. When they face their own struggles, they interpret them as signs of inadequacy. The narrator speaks with gentle firmness, reminding the listener that every meaningful accomplishment carries the fingerprints of countless mistakes. He explains that failure builds character by challenging entitlement, revealing blind spots, and forcing introspection. Through failure, people learn patience, humility, and perseverance. They discover which values truly matter and which ones collapse under pressure. He describes failure as a mirror that shows a person who they are without the camouflage of success. Some resist this reflection, growing bitter or defensive. Others use it as a guide, learning to rebuild intelligently rather than stubbornly. He tells the story of a friend who faced a devastating business collapse. At first, the friend interpreted it as proof that he was incompetent. He withdrew from opportunities, ashamed of what others might think. But as time passed, he realized that the collapse had exposed problems he had ignored for years: poor planning, shallow motivations, and the pressure of trying to prove something to others. When he faced these truths, he re-entered the world with more humility and clarity, building something far more aligned with who he was. The narrator describes this transformation with admiration, demonstrating how failure becomes a turning point when honesty replaces denial. The emotional atmosphere grows more contemplative as he explains that sometimes failure signals that a path is no longer right. People often cling to old dreams out of fear of disappointing others or abandoning past versions of themselves. But dreams evolve. Identity evolves. Failure can act as a gentle nudge, or a loud shove, toward a direction more aligned with truth. Accepting this requires courage, because it means letting go of familiar identities and embracing the vulnerability of beginning again. The narrator emphasizes that failure is not a punishment but a recalibration. It strips away illusions, revealing where effort belongs and where it has been wasted. It strengthens resilience not through avoidance but through endurance. The person who fails and rises becomes someone who trusts their own capacity to navigate uncertainty. He concludes this movement with a steady warmth, suggesting that the next emotional step will explore how pain, far from being something to escape, often becomes the most powerful teacher of all. The momentum continues with a quiet draw, inviting the listener forward into the deeper layers of the human experience. The emotional landscape shifts into a heavier, more intimate register as the narrator turns toward the subject people avoid until they can no longer outrun it: pain. He approaches it not as something to conquer, but as a companion woven through every human life. Pain is often treated like a defect, something shameful or inconvenient, yet the narrator explains that pain is one of the most honest forces a person encounters. It reveals truths people hide, exposes illusions they cling to, and forces them to confront themselves with clarity. Without pain, growth would be shallow, identity would be fragile, and meaning would dissolve into comfort. He describes how people are raised to believe that happiness should be the default state of life. When discomfort arises, they assume they have done something wrong. This misunderstanding creates a culture terrified of emotional struggle. Individuals numb themselves through distractions, avoiding any feeling that disturbs their internal equilibrium. But suppressing pain does not eliminate it, it buries it where it grows dense and heavy. The narrator explains that ignored pain becomes a weight carried quietly through the years, affecting choices, relationships, and self-perception in ways people scarcely notice. He recalls a period in his own life when he tried desperately to outrun grief after losing someone deeply important. At first, he drowned himself in noise, work, social interactions, entertainment, hoping these distractions would dull the ache gnawing at his chest. But grief waited patiently beneath it all. It surfaced at night, slipped into his thoughts during quiet moments, echoed in conversations that reminded him of what he had lost. Eventually, he realized that the only way to lessen the pain was to stop resisting it. When he finally allowed himself to feel the full weight of grief, he discovered that pain moved through him rather than destroying him. It softened him, made him more aware of what mattered, and taught him compassion he hadn't known he was capable of. The narrator explores how pain becomes meaningful when chosen consciously. People willingly endure discomfort for values they believe in. Athletes push through strain to pursue excellence. Parents sacrifice sleep for their children. Artists endure creative frustration to bring ideas to life. These pains feel purposeful, and their presence enriches the journey. Conversely, pain born from avoidance, broken boundaries, neglected dreams, dishonest relationships, creates emptiness. The narrator explains that choosing one's pain is an act of emotional maturity. He turns toward the story of a close friend whose life spiraled through addiction. The friend carried a deep ache he refused to confront, numbing it through substances that temporarily masked his wounds. For years, he lived in cycles of denial, shame, and self-destruction. The narrator speaks about him with tenderness and sorrow, describing how the friend eventually reached a point where the pain of staying the same exceeded the pain of changing. Recovery was not glamorous. It required confronting trauma, facing regret, and rebuilding self-worth one fragile step at a time. But the transformation that emerged was profound. The friend discovered strength not in avoiding pain but in facing it with honesty. The emotional tone deepens as the narrator explains that pain connects people to their humanity. Shared suffering creates invisible threads between strangers. The person who has grieved understands the tears of another. The person who has struggled with worth understands the hesitations in someone's voice. He describes pain as a soft language spoken silently between hearts, one that deepens empathy and dissolves the illusion of isolation. Pain becomes a bridge rather than a barrier. He then turns toward the modern impulse to numb pain with constant stimulation. People drown discomfort under screens, noise, consumption, or busyness. But distraction only delays healing. He explains that emotional numbness is not peace, it is avoidance. And avoidance grows into a quiet bitterness, the kind that creeps into conversations, relationships, and self-image. When someone finally chooses to engage with their pain, they reclaim the parts of themselves that numbness muted. The narrator describes how pain sharpens intuition. When someone listens carefully to their discomfort, they begin to understand what boundaries they need, what relationships they must release, what habits no longer serve them, and what truths they have avoided. Pain becomes a compass, pointing toward unresolved wounds, misaligned values, and unlived desires. Ignoring it prolongs suffering. Listening to it creates space for healing. As this movement nears its close, he explains that pain is not something to worship, but something to respect. It is neither a punishment nor a sign of weakness. It is a natural part of being alive. And when faced with courage, pain does not harden a person. It humbles them, revealing strength they did not know they possessed. The narrator hints that the next emotional turn will explore self-sabotage, the quiet patterns people fall into when they refuse to confront their pain, setting the stage for an even deeper unraveling of the human heart. The story continues with a somber, reflective tone as the narrator shifts into the subtle psychology of self-sabotage. He explains that people rarely ruin their lives through dramatic decisions. Instead, they do it quietly, through repeated avoidance, unspoken fears, hidden insecurities, and the patterns they refuse to acknowledge. Self-sabotage is rarely intentional. It often emerges from unhealed wounds and outdated beliefs about what someone deserves. The narrator describes it as a silent erosion, one that shapes a person's life without their awareness. He begins by revealing that self-sabotage often arises from familiarity. People cling to what hurts them because the discomfort is predictable. They return to partners who break their trust because loneliness scares them more than betrayal. They stay in jobs that suffocate them because the unknown terrifies them more than unhappiness. They avoid opportunities that could change their lives because the possibility of failure feels more threatening than the certainty of stagnation. The narrator explains that people prefer the pain they know to the fear they cannot map. He reflects on a period in his life when he consistently undermined opportunities that would have moved him forward. Whenever something good approached, a relationship, a creative chance, a path that required courage, he found reasons to retreat. Sometimes he convinced himself the timing was wrong. Sometimes he told himself he was not ready. Beneath these excuses was a quiet belief that he was undeserving. This belief guided him more than logic or desire. He describes this period with honesty, revealing that self-sabotage often masquerades as caution. The narration deepens as he explores how people avoid temporary discomfort at the cost of long-term peace. It is easier to avoid a difficult conversation than confront conflict. Easier to stay silent than admit a need. Easier to endure disrespect than assert boundaries. But this avoidance compounds over time, turning small issues into emotional injuries that shape identity. The narrator explains that avoidance becomes a prison built from choices made in fear, while courage becomes the key that unlocks the path forward. He tells the story of a woman he once knew who remained in a draining relationship because she feared life alone. She tolerated emotional neglect, forgiven repeated dishonesty, and convinced herself that endurance was love. But beneath her patience was a deep fear of abandonment. The narrator speaks about her with compassion, explaining that many people confuse loyalty with self-neglect. They stay where they are not valued because stepping into the unknown feels unbearable. Her eventual realization, that she deserved peace more than predictability, became the first step toward reclaiming her identity. The emotional tone grows heavier as the narrator explains how self-sabotage distorts self-perception. People convince themselves they are incapable, unworthy, or destined to fail. These beliefs become self-fulfilling. When someone believes they are undeserving of love, they push away the people who care. When they believe they cannot succeed, they abandon their efforts early. When they believe they are broken, they accept treatment that reinforces that belief. Self-sabotage is not the act of destroying one's life, it is the act of shrinking it piece by piece. The narrator emphasizes that the first step to breaking these patterns is recognizing the stories people tell themselves. Stories like, "I will be abandoned," "I will fail," "I am too difficult," "I am not enough." These narratives take root long before adulthood and shape emotional reactions in ways people rarely question. When someone begins challenging these stories, their world slowly expands. They start choosing discomfort over avoidance, action over fear, truth over self-delusion. He explains that transformation begins with small acts of responsibility. Expressing a boundary, saying no when exhausted, allowing oneself to be imperfect, or taking one small step toward a goal despite uncertainty. These actions accumulate, reshaping identity through lived experience rather than aspiration. A person proves to themselves, through repeated effort, that they are capable of change. The narration softens as he describes how self-sabotage dissolves when someone believes they deserve better. This belief cannot be forced. It grows gradually through practice, through choosing dignity over convenience, through giving oneself compassion, through letting go of relationships that demand self-erasure. As self-respect grows, self-sabotage loses its grip. In the closing tone of this movement, the narrator suggests that the next unfolding truth will turn toward entitlement and the ways people expect life to cushion their discomfort, revealing yet another layer of emotional complexity. The momentum remains steady and grounded, guiding the listener forward into the next chapter of understanding. The emotional current moves into a sharper, more revealing tone as the narrator turns toward a subtle force that quietly shapes countless disappointments: entitlement. He approaches the topic carefully, peeling back the layers of misunderstanding around it. Most people imagine entitlement as loud arrogance, someone demanding special treatment or privileges. But the narrator explains that entitlement is often far quieter. It emerges in the belief that our problems are more important than anyone else's, that our suffering deserves special exemption, or that life should bend to our expectations simply because we feel deeply. He reflects on the less obvious forms of entitlement that appear in everyday life. There is the entitlement of believing we are owed success because we worked hard. The entitlement of believing love should last simply because we want it to. The entitlement of thinking we deserve to feel good all the time. And the most seductive form of all, the belief that our dreams are meaningful simply because we hold them, even if we take no action to build them. The narrator explains that these subtle entitlements create quiet resentment when reality fails to align with our imagined significance. He recalls a version of himself who carried this quieter entitlement without recognizing it. He expected opportunities to arrive simply because he wanted them. He believed people should appreciate his efforts regardless of their impact. He wanted growth without sacrifice, clarity without struggle, and admiration without vulnerability. When life did not reward him, he blamed circumstances or timing, convinced that he was unlucky rather than unprepared. This mindset shielded his ego but kept him stagnant. He describes that period with humility, revealing how entitlement quietly disconnects people from reality by replacing responsibility with expectation. The narrator turns toward the emotional roots of entitlement, explaining that it often stems not from arrogance, but from fear. Fear of inadequacy. Fear of effort. Fear of facing one's limitations. Entitlement becomes a shield, protecting people from the uncomfortable truth that life does not guarantee fairness and does not owe any of us success. He explains that accepting this truth is painful because it forces us to confront the fragility of our hopes. But this acceptance also becomes the beginning of emotional maturity. He shifts into a more relational tone, examining how entitlement shapes interactions with others. People who expect constant admiration suffocate relationships with their need for validation. Those who believe they deserve loyalty without offering accountability create imbalances that breed resentment. Those who expect partners to fill emotional voids they refuse to face place impossible burdens on love. The narrator describes these patterns with quiet sadness, not to shame anyone, but to show how entitlement erodes the possibility of authentic connection by turning relationships into transactions rather than shared experiences. He speaks about a couple he once knew who held unspoken expectations that the other should anticipate and fulfill every emotional need. Each felt slighted when the other failed to guess their desires, and both carried silent entitlement disguised as vulnerability. Their relationship eventually fractured under the weight of these unspoken demands. The narrator reflects on their story as an illustration of how entitlement often masquerades as emotional sensitivity, when in truth, it arises from the unwillingness to communicate openly and take responsibility for one's inner world. The emotional tone deepens as he contrasts entitlement with responsibility. Responsibility does not guarantee comfort, but it creates stability. It does not offer shortcuts, but it offers grounding. It acknowledges that effort, not expectation, shapes outcomes. When someone adopts responsibility, they stop demanding that life align with their desires and begin shaping their actions to align with their values. The narrator explains that this shift transforms the emotional landscape. Resentment weakens. Gratitude strengthens. The world feels less unfair and more navigable, not because circumstances change but because perspective does. He then turns toward the idea that entitlement distorts suffering. People often believe their pain is unique, more intense, more meaningful than others. But pain is universal. Everyone carries wounds. Everyone suffers losses. Everyone fears failure. Recognizing this does not diminish our own struggles. It connects us to the humanity we share. The narrator describes pain as a common thread woven through all lives, reminding us that we are never as isolated as we believe. Entitlement isolates us by convincing us that our suffering is special. Responsibility reconnects us by reminding us that suffering is shared. He shares a memory of sitting alone in a cafe, watching strangers move through their routines, laughing, arguing, comforting, grieving in quiet ways only the observant would notice. In that moment he realized that no life is free of burden. No path is without struggle. This awareness softened something in him, replacing resentment with humility. When he let go of the belief that life owed him comfort, he began appreciating moments of ease as gifts rather than expectations. The narration gathers into a contemplative warmth as he explains that releasing entitlement frees people to experience gratitude. Gratitude does not arise from abundance, but from awareness. When someone stops assuming they deserve more, they begin noticing what they already have: peaceful mornings, supportive connections, moments of clarity, even lessons extracted from hardship. Gratitude becomes the antidote to entitlement because it shifts focus from what is missing to what is meaningful. As the movement closes, the narrator suggests through emotional momentum, not instruction, that the next unfolding truth will explore boundaries and acceptance, two forces essential to creating a grounded, emotionally mature life. The tone settles like a steady breath, guiding the listener into the next evolution of understanding. The narrative continues with a measured, reflective calm as the narrator steps into the essence of emotional self-protection, the creation of boundaries. He explains that boundaries are not barriers meant to distance us from others, but structures that preserve our ability to show up authentically. Without boundaries, people dissolve into the expectations around them, losing clarity about who they are and what they value. The narrator speaks about this delicately, acknowledging how difficult boundaries can be for those who associate them with rejection or conflict. He describes how many people avoid setting boundaries because they fear disappointing others. They say yes when they are exhausted, remain silent to avoid tension, and stretch themselves thin to maintain comfort for those around them. These choices appear generous, but they slowly hollow a person from the inside. The narrator explains that saying yes without capacity is not kindness, it is self-abandonment. Boundaries become acts of honesty that prevent resentment from quietly poisoning relationships. He reflects on a time when he lived without boundaries, believing that being accommodating would bring him love and stability. Instead, it left him overwhelmed. He spent his days managing the emotional needs of others while neglecting his own. Over time, he began resenting people he cared about, not because they were demanding but because he never expressed his limits. This realization hit him with a painful clarity: people cannot honor boundaries that are never communicated. When he finally began setting limits, relationships either adapted with respect or revealed their incompatibility. The narrator shifts into a softer tone as he explains that boundaries require acceptance. Acceptance that not everyone will understand them, acceptance that some relationships will change, and acceptance that personal needs are not selfish. He describes acceptance as a form of emotional surrender, a willingness to let reality be what it is rather than what we wish it could be. People often cling to fantasies of how others should act or how situations should unfold. Boundaries dissolve those fantasies, revealing the truth beneath them. He shares the story of a relationship where both partners clung to idealized images of each other. They believed love meant constant harmony, effortless understanding, and emotional perfection. These expectations created silent pressure, leaving little room for authenticity. The relationship improved only when they accepted each other's imperfections and allowed boundaries to guide communication. Acceptance did not weaken their connection, it strengthened it by replacing fantasy with truth. The emotional tone deepens as the narrator explains that boundaries also apply to the relationship we hold with ourselves. People often push beyond their limits because they believe rest is weakness or self-care is indulgent. They criticize themselves harshly for mistakes they would forgive in others. They demand perfection where patience is needed. Boundaries become the internal voice that says, "This is enough, this is too much, this needs attention, this needs release." Without internal boundaries, self-respect erodes. He turns toward the idea that choosing limitations is an act of freedom. Modern life promises endless possibilities, but endless choice overwhelms the mind. People dream of limitless potential, yet feel more anxious than empowered. The narrator explains that intentional constraint creates clarity. When someone decides what they will not tolerate, not pursue, not sacrifice, their life becomes more defined. Boundaries are the framework within which meaningful living becomes possible. He reflects on how saying no becomes a skill that honors both oneself and others. A sincere no prevents false promises, emotional depletion, and hidden resentment. It creates space for yes that are meaningful rather than obligatory. The narrator explains that relationships built on honesty, even when uncomfortable, are far healthier than relationships built on silent compliance. He shares a moment when setting a boundary saved a friendship. He had a friend who leaned heavily on him for emotional support but offered little in return. For years he said nothing, absorbing the weight until resentment built silently. When he finally expressed his limits, the friend initially reacted with confusion, but eventually adjusted. Their friendship became more balanced and genuine, proving that boundaries do not destroy connection, they clarify it. As the emotional movement settles, the narrator hints through the softness of his tone that the next unfolding truth will explore how embracing the ordinary frees people from the pressure to perform extraordinary lives. The narrative glides forward with a grounded steadiness, preparing the listener for the next layer of understanding. The emotional current softens into a reflective, almost meditative calm as the narrator begins exploring a truth many resist yet quietly long for: the idea that embracing an ordinary life is not a surrender, but a profound liberation. He explains that modern culture floods people with stories of extraordinary achievement, giving the illusion that meaning must be spectacular to be real. Every day, people compare their quiet routines to the highlight reels of others, slowly convincing themselves that ordinariness is failure. They chase significance with a frantic hunger, believing that worth is earned through greatness rather than lived through sincerity. The narrator dismantles this illusion with patient clarity. He describes how the constant pressure to stand out exhausts the spirit. People treat their lives like competitions, searching for achievements that validate them, relationships that impress others, or identities that draw admiration. But this pursuit drains joy from the moments that truly matter. When someone believes only extraordinary things create meaning, they overlook the quiet miracles that fill their days, conversations that deepen connection, small acts of kindness that soften the world, and personal victories that go unseen by everyone but themselves. He reflects on a time in his life when he felt trapped by the belief that he needed to be exceptional. Every day became a silent test he was failing. He remembers waking up with a tightness in his chest, feeling behind before the day even began. He believed greatness would finally quiet his insecurities, finally grant him permission to rest. But the more he chased extraordinariness, the more distant peace felt. The pursuit itself became a treadmill, propelling him forward without ever moving closer to fulfillment. Only when he allowed himself to stop running did he realize how deeply exhausted he had become. The narrator turns inward as he explains that embracing ordinariness is not about giving up ambition. It is about shifting ambition from the external to the internal. Extraordinary achievements are rare and often fleeting, but meaning grows from consistency, honesty, and presence. The narrator describes how he once overlooked the beauty of simple mornings: sunlight through a window, the warmth of a quiet cup of coffee, the soft beginnings of a new day, because he was too focused on achievements that would make him appear significant. When he stopped measuring his life through comparison, he began to savor these moments with a depth he had never allowed himself to feel. He introduces the idea that ordinariness creates space for authentic relationships. People who chase constant extraordinariness often treat relationships as validation rather than connection. They hide their flaws, perform confidence, or measure their value through how much admiration they can generate. This performance keeps them distant from genuine intimacy. But when someone embraces their own ordinariness, they become more present, more authentic, and more compassionate. They engage with people not as sources of validation but as partners in shared humanity. The narrator shares the memory of a man he met during his travels, a quiet individual who worked a modest job and lived without fanfare, yet carried a peaceful radiance that felt rare. When asked if he ever wished for a more glamorous life, the man smiled softly and said that he had everything he needed. His days were filled with intention, his relationships were warm, and his heart was steady. The narrator describes this moment with reverence, realizing that a meaningful life is not measured by scale but by sincerity. He then shifts toward the emotional withdrawal many feel when they cling to extraordinary expectations. People become impatient with their progress, ashamed of their imperfections, and resentful when life does not match their imagined potential. They miss the depth and slow growth, overlook the beauty and consistency, and forget that an ordinary day lived with intention holds more meaning than an extraordinary moment lived for attention. The narrator explains that embracing ordinariness allows people to move through life without the constant pressure of proving themselves. The narrative deepens as he explores how ordinariness reduces jealousy. People who believe they must be exceptional often become consumed by comparison. They resent others' successes because those successes highlight their own perceived inadequacies. But when someone accepts that their life does not need to be spectacular to be worthy, jealousy loosens its grip. People begin celebrating others without feeling diminished. They stop viewing life as a competition and start viewing it as a shared journey. He reflects on how many moments of meaning are found in repetition. Love deepens through mundane rituals. Healing happens through small choices repeated over time. Wisdom arises from experiences lived slowly, not from sudden breakthroughs. When someone embraces the ordinary, they attune themselves to the subtleties of daily life, the laughter that breaks tension, the silence that brings clarity, the routines that build stability. Meaning reveals itself not in the extraordinary, but in the accumulation of quiet moments that shape identity. The emotional tone warms as he explains that ordinariness is not a limitation. It is a grounding force. It frees people from the tyranny of impossible expectations and allows them to rediscover the richness within their already existing lives. It encourages them to focus on what they can control, how they treat others, how they honor their values, how they respond to difficulty, how they appreciate the present moment. As this movement settles, the narrator directs the emotional flow toward a deeper truth waiting beneath every struggle. Mortality, the final boundary that gives shape and urgency to human life. Through tone alone, he guides the listener forward into the next unfolding realization, where the acceptance of life's finiteness becomes the compass that clarifies what truly matters. The emotional atmosphere thickens with gravity as the narrator steps into the deepest and most transformative truth of all, mortality. He speaks of it with a reverence that suggests not fear but understanding. Mortality is a truth that shadows every life, shaping choices and priorities even when people try to ignore it. Most avoid thinking about death because it unsettles them. They wrap themselves in routines, distractions, and ambitions, hoping these will create a sense of control. But death, the narrator explains, is the ultimate reminder that control is fleeting and time is precious. He reflects on how people behave when they believe life stretches endlessly before them. They postpone important conversations, convinced there will always be another chance. They delay healing, assuming they can confront their wounds later. They tolerate relationships that drain them and ignore dreams that whisper quietly. Mortality shatters these illusions. When someone allows the reality of death to settle into their awareness, not as a distant philosophical idea, but as a personal certainty, everything shifts. Priorities sharpen. Boundaries strengthen. Gratitude deepens. The narrator shares the memory of losing someone he admired deeply. The news arrived unexpectedly, shattering the ordinary rhythm of his day. He recalls walking outside afterward, stunned by how unchanged the world seemed. People moved through their routines, unaware that his inner world had cracked open. Colors looked sharper, sounds felt heavier, and the air carried an unfamiliar stillness. That experience forced him to confront how fragile life is. It changed the way he viewed time, revealing how easily it slips away while people remain tangled in trivial frustrations. He explains that death gives life its shape. Without an ending, moments would lose their weight. Choices would lose their urgency. meaning would evaporate. Mortality is the boundary that makes every emotion, every risk, every relationship significant. It reminds people that the most precious things, connection, purpose, love, cannot be taken for granted. When someone embraces this truth, they stop seeking perfection and start seeking presence. The narrator turns inward as he describes how mortality clarifies values. When people imagine their final moments, their concerns shrink into simplicity. They do not think about wealth, status, or admiration. They think about whether they loved deeply, forgave generously, created honestly, and lived with sincerity. Mortality strips away illusions and leaves only truths that matter. This awareness becomes a guide, urging people to align their lives with the values that resonate most. He recalls a conversation with an elderly man who had lived through war, heartbreak, joy, and disappointment. The man said that most of what he worried about turned out to be irrelevant. The narrator describes how the man spoke not with regret, but with calm acceptance. What he cherished were not extraordinary achievements but small moments of connection, courage, and kindness. This conversation shifted the narrator's understanding of meaning, revealing that purpose grows from the heart, not from accomplishments. The emotional tone deepens as he explains that accepting mortality encourages people to let go of resentment, perfectionism, and fear. Resentment loses its power because time is too precious to spend on bitterness. Perfectionism loses its grip because imperfection is what makes life human. Fear becomes less paralyzing because the cost of avoiding life becomes too high. Mortality teaches people to participate fully, to choose honesty over comfort, and to express love before it is too late. He reflects on how mortality softens people, expanding their compassion. When someone realizes that everyone they meet is moving through a temporary, fragile existence, kindness becomes instinctive. Patience becomes easier. Judgment becomes less harsh. A recognition settles in the heart. Every person is facing their own private struggles beneath the surface. This awareness brings a tenderness to the world, a gentleness that transforms how people relate to one another. The narrator explains that accepting death is not morbid, it is liberating. It allows people to stop clinging to illusions of control and start engaging with life as it is. It teaches them to appreciate the ordinary, to forgive more often, to pursue what matters, and to release what does not. It is the final boundary that makes all other choices meaningful. As this movement comes to a quiet close, the emotional current gathers into a powerful momentum. The narrator guides the listener forward into the final realization waiting ahead, where the threads of pain, responsibility, boundaries, values, ordinariness, and mortality weave together into a single truth about what it means to live with intention, sincerity, and depth. The emotional energy gathers into a quiet, steady intensity as the narrator moves toward the final realization that ties every thread of the journey into one living truth. Meaning does not arrive from the outside. It is built from within, shaped through the values we choose, the struggles we accept, and the courage we bring to the moments that test us. He speaks with a warmth that feels earned, as though every insight shared so far has brought him to a deeper understanding of what it means to live a life that feels honest. He explains that people spend much of their lives searching for purpose as though it is an object hidden somewhere, waiting to be discovered. They look for signs, waiting for clarity to descend before they act. But purpose rarely reveals itself in advance. It is created through participation, shaped by decisions, commitments, and risks. Every meaningful direction begins with a step taken in uncertainty. The narrator describes how he once waited endlessly for certainty before moving forward, believing clarity should come first. But life taught him the opposite. Clarity comes from engagement, not hesitation. The narrative deepens as he reflects on how values determine the stories people tell about themselves. Someone who values comfort sees difficulty as unfair. Someone who values growth sees difficulty as necessary. Someone who values approval sacrifices their truth for acceptance. Someone who values courage speaks honestly even when their voice shakes. Values influence the meaning people extract from every experience. They dictate what feels worth suffering for and what feels worth releasing. When someone chooses their values intentionally, they choose the direction of their life. He describes sitting in his apartment years ago, surrounded by reminders of a life he had outgrown, unfinished projects, memories of relationships shaped by avoidance, and the lingering echo of decisions made to impress others rather than satisfy his soul. The silence in that room felt heavy, but inside that heaviness was a quiet honesty he had avoided for too long. He realized he had been living according to borrowed values, shaped by expectations rather than truth. That recognition broke something open in him. It was not a dramatic transformation, but a gentle shift that allowed him to rebuild his life from the inside out. The narrator explains that growth rarely arrives as a sudden revelation. It forms slowly, shaped by thousands of small choices, choosing to speak honestly during a tense moment, choosing to set a boundary instead of staying silent, choosing to take responsibility instead of assigning blame, choosing to feel instead of numbing. These acts of intention accumulate, altering the inner landscape until someone realizes they have become different from who they once were. Identity, he says, is not found. It is crafted. He turns toward the role of pain in this evolution. Pain teaches humility. It strips away illusions, forcing people to confront truths that comfort could never reveal. Pain highlights the values that matter and exposes the ones that crumble under pressure. A person who avoids pain avoids the opportunity to understand themselves. But someone who faces it with honesty emerges more grounded, more compassionate, and more connected to their own humanity. The narrator explains that pain is not the enemy. Denial is. The emotional tone strengthens as he reflects on how relationships evolve through this lens. Healthy connections require vulnerability, not perfection. They require the willingness to be seen, not the desire to be admired. When someone stops trying to prove themselves, they create space for companionship that feels real. When they embrace responsibility instead of expectation, they cultivate trust. When they set boundaries, they protect the parts of themselves that allow them to love fully. Relationships grow not through grand romantic gestures, but through consistent authenticity. He shares an encounter with a friend who once said that people spend too much time waiting for the right moment, forgetting that the right moment begins the second they choose to show up fully. This insight lingered with the narrator, becoming a quiet reminder that life is always happening now. Waiting for a better time only guarantees regret. The narration continues with a deeper calm as he describes how mortality sharpens the meaning of every choice. When someone remembers that their time is finite, they stop postponing the conversations they fear, stop delaying the dreams that feel fragile, stop tolerating situations that drain them. Mortality brings urgency, but not the frantic urgency of productivity, it brings the urgency of presence. It reminds people that the most meaningful things in life often require courage, not perfection. He then moves gently into the truth that meaning is built not through extraordinary moments, but through sincerity in ordinary ones. The person who listens fully creates meaning. The person who apologizes sincerely creates meaning. The person who forgives, tries again, expresses gratitude, or chooses compassion in a difficult moment creates meaning. These small acts form the emotional architecture of a life well lived. They are not dramatic, but they are defining. The narrator's voice softens as he explains that the journey of living with intention is not about eliminating fear, doubt, or insecurity. It is about moving forward alongside them. Courage is not the absence of fear but the willingness to walk with it. A meaningful life is not one without struggle but one where the struggles align with what matters. As the closing movement unfolds, he reflects on the quiet truth that meaning is a daily choice. Each morning, someone can choose what to care about, what to release, what to pursue, and how to respond. They can choose which stories to believe and which ones to let go. They can choose presence over distraction, responsibility over resentment, honesty over comfort. These choices, repeated over time, shape a life that feels full, grounded, and sincere. The ending arrives with no rush, just a deep, steady breath as the narrator explains that life will never be perfect, predictable, or entirely gentle. But it will always offer the opportunity to care about the things that matter, to love in ways that feel true, and to build meaning from the inside out. The listener is left not with a command, but with a feeling, a quiet awareness that the power to shape a meaningful life rests within their own hands, waiting for them to choose what truly deserves their attention. The story settles into a warm stillness, offering a final lingering reminder that meaning is not found in the noise or the extraordinary, but in the steady, intentional act of living fully, courageously, and honestly in the time we have.